Have you ever felt that some stones hold memories, as if they breathed time? Sometimes you just need to touch an old block to notice that it vibrates differently, as if there a story was recorded that no one remembers anymore. A story that doesn't begin with kings, empires, or known civilizations, but with forgotten peoples who walked the earth before history even began to be written. If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is just the thing that your soul needed to hear. Imagine a very old night. There were no cities. There were no temples. There were no books. Humanity was still in its infancy. But somewhere isolated in the world, silent hands, they lifted tons of stones, aligned with precisions that modern science still attempts to understand. Who were they? What did they know? And why did they insist on leaving monuments that would survive entire ages of oblivion? Archaeology tries to explain these structures as the work of simple societies. But when we look closer, when we see not just the stone but the intention, the symbolism, mathematics, and astronomy engraved on them, we realize that something is not closes. Not even. It is as if these buildings were portals to a memory that insists on return. A memory that speaks of people who lived before the first civilizations known, before writing, before organized agriculture. And yet, they left works so advanced that they seem to challenge everything we believe about our own history. Maybe you've already felt this. A soft intuition, almost a whisper, telling you that our journey on Earth is much older than we have been taught. That before Sumeria, Egypt, India, or China, other cultures walked here. Cultures that understood the sky, time, spirit, and stone in ways we have barely begun to understand. And it is precisely about them that we are going to talk. Because if something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here. And now, let's go to the first sign left by the people that the world insists on forget. When we talk about ancient civilizations, we usually imagine cities, temples, kings, and armies. But what few realize is that before all this emerged, long before Uruk raised its walls, before Egypt raised its pyramids, before China recorded its first symbols, there were already people who dominated something that seems impossible for the period in which they lived. The art of moving the stone, the science of aligning the sky, the ability to remember what we have forgotten. They had no writing. They left no documents. They didn't build libraries. And yet thus, they built structures so complex that today they force archaeologists, physicists, and engineers looking at them with discomfort, because they simply don't fit into the that we learned about prehistory. Imagine small dispersed groups, living in arid, cold, or wild regions, without developed agriculture, without metallurgy, without any technology that we know. But for some reason, moved by a deep spiritual and mathematical intention, they decided to erect gigantic monuments in solid stone, monuments aligned with stars, solstices, cardinal points, monuments that would require strength, coordination, techniques of engineering and cooperation that theoretically would only appear thousands of years later. This is where the mystery begins, because these people lived before the first civilizations, and yet they built works that seem to belong to a more advanced world than theirs. The question that echoes among researchers is always the same. How? As groups so small, without cities, without writing, without advanced tools, could have accomplished feats that today, with heavy machines, would still be extremely complex. But perhaps this question is incomplete. Perhaps the real enigma is not how they did it, but why they did it. Why build megaliths before organized agriculture? Why move stones weighing dozens of tons before creating refined ceramics? Why build astronomical calendars before building cities? Why record the sky, light, and time before recording your own history? When we observe these monuments with an attentive heart, we notice something subtle. They don't look like utilitarian works. They are not designed to house, protect, store, or save. They were made to remember. Remember what? Remember who? Remember why? Some archaeologists suggest that these people were reconstructing memories fragmented from something they saw, experienced, or witnessed. Others believe that we're replicating older structures, perhaps inherited from a past that did not we know. There are still those who argue that these monuments were bridges between heaven and earth, between the visible and the invisible, between the human and the sacred. And when we look at each stone, when we feel the silence between them, something inside we recognize this intention dog. Because megaliths are not born by chance. They are born from memories. And the first memory they keep is this. There were peoples before peoples, cultures before cultures, memories before history, and they tried not to disappear. But what exactly did they leave behind? This is what we will unveil in the next block. When we observe the first stone monuments in the world, something unsettling happens. The timeline simply doesn't behave as it should. What do we call of prehistory does not seem as simple, as linear, as gradual as we learned in school. Why, the contrary. The more we dig, the more we realize that the antiquity of the earth holds paradoxes, suspensions, and interruptions that defy the traditional logic of cultural evolution. And one of the greatest examples of this rests in a silent place in the southeast Turkey, Göbekli Tepe. Imagine this scenario. 12,000 years ago, humanity was still made up of hunter-gatherers, nomadic, dispersed people, without agriculture, without cities, without writing. And yet, in this supposedly primitive period, someone erected monumental circle stone with T-shaped columns, some weighing up to 15 tons. Columns carved with animal figures, symbols, patterns, and iconography that looks more advanced than anything expected at the time. It's as if prehistory had received a visit from the future. The most intriguing? Göbekli Tepe is thousands of years older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, older than the first temples of Sumeria. It is so old that it defies the very birth of civilization. Because if these people were just hunter-gatherers, how could they carry out such a work? How did they organize labor? How did they lift the stones? How symbols developed so complex without cities or written language? This monument alone would be enough to shake everything we know. But Göbekli Tepe is just the beginning. In the Sahara Desert, now arid and silent, there was an astronomical observatory prehistoric beach called Nabta Playa, dating back to around 7,000 years. Ago. There stones lined up mark solstices, star placements, and seasonal rhythms with precision impressive. It is a calendar built before any Egyptian temple exists. And once again, questions arise. Who taught these people to read the sky? Why was this knowledge so urgent? And how did such an ancient community know that does the earth move in cycles that repeat themselves with mathematical perfection? Advancing towards Europe, we find Stonehenge, another megalithic monument whose construction spanned centuries and required engineering, astronomy, and a spiritual vision that seems disproportionate to the time. Every stone, every alignment, every opening seems follow a purpose that mixes mathematics with ritual, light with transcendence. But there is something even more curious. Completely different civilizations, separated by oceans, climates, and cultures, raised megaliths following similar patterns. Stone circles, solar alignments, star markers, cyclopean tombs, symbolic portals. It's as if they are all responding to a common memory, a memory that precedes the very idea of civilization. This is the chronological paradox of megaliths. They appear much earlier than they should, carrying a complexity that does not match the societies that built them, at least not in the way we describe them. And this leads us to a deep, delicate, and inevitable question. Were these people reinventing something that had already existed before them? Something they learned from inherited memories, fragments of a culture still older, or perhaps with masters that history has forgotten? It is this track that we will begin to follow in the next block. When we look at the megaliths scattered around the world, a subtle sensation begins to emerge, almost like a distant echo. They seem to be talking to each other, as if people separated by thousands of kilometers, who had never met, had shared the same inner compass, a spiritual, symbolic, and astronomical compass. And that gives us leads to one of the most profound enigmas in all of archaeology. Why are cultures so? Did distant people create such similar structures? In the British Isles, stone circles. In French Brittany, gigantic alignments. In the African desert, solar observatories. In Asia, monolithic pillars line the sky. In Oceania, upright rocks oriented by the stars. In South America, temples that integrate architecture, light, and astral movement. They were not simply piled rocks. They were spiritual maps. They were calendars, portals, memory instruments. Every stone seemed to point to something coming from above, or something that came from within. The most disturbing thing is that these cultures lived in different eras, under different climates, guided by different mythologies, and yet they repeated identical patterns. The circle as a symbol of eternity age, solar alignment as a bridge between worlds, the opening to the solstice as rebirth, the vertical stone as the axis between heaven and earth. It's as if they all carry the same dream, the same memory, the same instruction. But how is this possible? Some archaeologists defend the theory that such ideas arose independently, as natural responses to observations of the sky. Others believe that ancient roots migratory movements connected this knowledge, but there are those who see something deeper, the hypothesis that these cultures inherited fragments of even more ancient knowledge, a knowledge that came before the great oblivion of humanity. In indigenous legends, priests speak of people who came from the light. In Polynesia, elders say that the first are those who lifted the stones. In the Mediterranean, ancient myths describe the silent builders. In Africa, several traditions call these ancestors those who knew. Always the same pattern. Memories of previous people, almost always lost, almost always mysterious, almost always associated with the sky. But there is another point that makes this enigma even more fascinating. The similarities symbolic. In places separated by oceans, we find snakes, spirals, animals, totemic and anthropomorphic figures with arms open to the firmament. Why so much repetition? Why does the same visual language appear in such distant places? A spiritual hypothesis, perhaps the most poetic, suggests that these cultures were connected by a deep, ancestral, intuitive consciousness, that they didn't copy each other, but they accessed the same perceptions, the same truths, the same mysteries that heaven offered to anyone who had the courage to listen to it. Another theory states that these similarities were born from a common memory, an inherited memory, perhaps coming from a people prior to the cataclysm that ended the last era of ice, a people who would have transmitted their knowledge orally, symbolically and astronomical, and then disappeared, leaving only fragmented traces in rocks, myths, and impossible alignments. Regardless of the theory, one thing is certain. These monuments are not works isolated. They are chapters of the same book, a book written before history, before word, before agriculture, and which still tries to remind us of something forgotten. And it is precisely in this lost memory that we will find the next clue. There is something deeply disconcerting about walking among ancient megaliths. At first, we only see huge rocks, but as we got closer, we realized marks, fittings, cuts, polishing angles and orientations that do not match the image we make of simple people from prehistory. And then the question arises that hangs like a cold wind over every archaeological site. How did they do it? In many of these monuments, the stones are not just large, they are monumental, blocks of 10, 15, 20 tons, some reaching 60. In places like Baalbek, in Lebanon, we find monoliths that exceed 800 tons, so perfect that any attempt to move them today would require machinery, state-of-the-art industrial plants. And even then, it would be risky. In other regions, we see cuts so precise that they resemble industrial metal blades. The junction between the stones is so tight that a razor blade cannot pass between them. How is this possible using stone tools? How is it possible to achieve such precision? No written language, no formal calculations, no modern measuring instruments. The conventional narrative tries to explain everything with human effort and time. But by observing these details, we realize that there is more than strength. There is intention, there is technique, there is engineering knowledge, and most importantly, there is awareness. Why? Because lifting something weighing 10 tons with raw effort is possible, but lift something weighing 10 tons following an astronomical alignment to the millimeter is another story. Requires calculation, requires observation. It requires an integrated worldview, in which heaven and land are not separate, but part of a single language. This is where many researchers begin to see a subtle form of technology, not modern technology based on engines and metal, but an ancient technology based on cooperation, rhythm, sacred geometry, knowledge of terrain and weight, perhaps even techniques that we have forgotten today. And the more we study these monuments, the more we realize that the construction was only half the process. The other half was the purpose. The stones were not erected out of necessity, but out of meaning. They were not erected as a shelter, but as a message. They were not erected by power, but by memory. Memory of what? Whose memory? One of the most interesting spiritual hypotheses states that these people were fixing in the physical world something that could not be said. A kind of mathematics of the soul, engraved on rocks so that time would not erase your wisdom. Another hypothesis, from scholars who mix archaeology with depth psychology, says that these monuments were mirrors of consciousness, structures that allowed human beings remember their connection with the cosmos, with the spirit, with the ancestry, that it is not measured in centuries, but in eras. And there are still those who suggest something bolder, that these megaliths are the last works from a lineage of knowledge that predates the world as we know it, fragments of a legacy left by cultures that disappeared after cataclysms, leaving only the silent instruction to lift up what cannot be forgotten. Whatever the answer, one truth is repeated in every stone. These people knew something that we lost. If something within you is awakening, stay here, because in the next block, we're going to touch on the memory that precedes all memories, and perhaps feel where this knowledge came from. When we study the megaliths spread around the world, something begins to become evident. They are not just constructions. They are survivors, remains of a memory that insists on going through cataclysms, oblivion, and changes of eras. And this perception leads us to a sensitive point, almost always avoided by traditional archaeology. The possibility that humanity has already experienced previous cycles of greatness and destruction. For thousands of years, the planet has undergone abrupt climate changes, glaciation, violent thaws, prolonged droughts, gigantic tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes that darkened the sky, events that could easily erase entire cultures without leaving traces of wood, fabric, houses, rituals, stories, nothing but what resists the time. The stone. This is why some researchers believe that megaliths are not the beginning of story, but the end of another. They are petrified memories of a world before ours, a world that ended suddenly, a world that may have existed during last ice age, when sea level was more than 100 meters below current levels in vast regions, today submerged, were habitable. When we observe that gigantic monuments appear shortly after the end of the last glaciation, the impression is that these people were rebuilding something that had already knew, as if, after a great collapse, surviving groups had tried to recover the lost memory of older knowledge, transmitting it through symbols, rituals, and stones aligned to the sky. And then the question arises that echoes like a murmur within the soul. Where did this knowledge come from? Some say it came from observing nature. Others say it came from dreams, myths, and the visions of shamans. But there are those who believe that this knowledge came from a mother culture, a civilization prior to the first ones we know, perhaps destroyed by a cataclysm global, leaving only scattered survivors who transmitted their last fragments of wisdom. This hypothesis appears in legends around the world. The wise men who escaped the Great Flood, the masters who taught agriculture, astronomy, and healing, travelers who came from the sea bringing knowledge, the guardians of the light who helped humanity start over. It doesn't matter if we listen to the Mayans, the indigenous people of North America, the people of Oceania, Egyptian, ancient Greek, or Eastern traditions. The structure of myth is always the same. Something was lost and something was rebuilt. This repetition is no coincidence. It's memory. And when we read the rocks, the astronomical alignments, the engineering marks, and the silence that surrounds these monuments, we realize something even deeper. They were erected only to mark time, but to cross it. They were not built to defy nature, but to dialogue with it. They weren't made to impress, but to remember. Remember that humanity has already been through long nights. Remember that we have already risen after deep falls. Remember that we are heirs to stories that are much older than we imagine. The stone, unlike us, does not forget, and it is precisely at this point, at the bridge between what was and what remains, that we begin to understand something essential. Megaliths are not monuments of the past, but messages for the future. And in the next block, we will get into the heart of this message. When we calmly observe these gigantic monuments, something begins to occur, stand out, not in the stones themselves, but in the emptiness around them. A thick silence, a type of pause that seems to invite those arriving to breathe more slowly. It's as if these places were built not just to be seen but to be felt. And this is where a profound, almost uncomfortable question arises. Why did such ancient people would they dedicate themselves to building such enormous structures without an immediate practical objective? The answer may lie in something that has no place in museums, the spiritual psychology of these peoples. Modern humanity thinks in terms of utility. Houses are for living, bridges used to cross, walls serve to separate. But for these forgotten people, the stone had another purpose. It was a conductor of the unseen, a driver between dimensions, an amplifier of internal states. Many archaeologists are surprised to realize that these sites have no marks of housing, they have no food remains, they have no evidence of daily routines. They weren't cities, they were not fortresses, they weren't shelters, they were places of experience, places where human beings found themselves, places where heaven and earth kissed, places where the soul could hear echoes of what the human voice could not yet name. Some recent studies show that certain megalithic formations create effects impressive acoustics. In certain chambers, the human voice resonates as if it were floating. In others, low sounds intensify in the chest, creating a bodily sensation which many describe as spiritual. This cannot be a coincidence. Sound shapes consciousness. Light shapes perception. The stone shapes silence. And these people knew it. They knew that the human mind changes when light enters from a specific angle. They knew that solar cycles influence emotional states and rituals. They knew that certain alignments with heaven create experiences of transcendence, not because they had laboratories, but because they had sensitivity, because they listened to the world, because they perceived the subtle, because they didn't just live on the surface of the senses, but in its interstices. This is why so many megaliths align with sunrise on the solstice. It wasn't for marking time like an agricultural calendar, at least not just for that. It was for mark the spirit, to create a sacred instant, a moment when light passed through the portal with millimeter precision and touched the center of the building like a finger of fire. Imagine what this did to human beings who spent their lives watching the sky, feeling the wind, reading the silence. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a revelation. And maybe that's why these people erected huge stones, because they wanted to materialize the invisible, giving shape to what cannot be seen, anchoring on earth that which can only be feel it in your heart. They built to remember, they built to awaken, they built to transform. And it is this kind of awakening, an awakening that spans millennia, that prepares us for the last great layer of this mystery. Because in the next block we will see that these people perhaps were not just builders, but guardians of something that could not be lost. When we put all the pieces together, the impossible alignments, the colossal stones, the repeated symbols, the echoes of myths spread across the world, an image begins to emerge form, slowly and silently, like a figure emerging from the mist, an image that many avoid it, but it becomes inevitable for anyone who observes sincerely. People, those who built the first megaliths, were perhaps not just builders, maybe were guardians. Guardian is the one who preserves what cannot be lost. And, apparently, these people were protecting something that could not fit into words, something that could not be written, something that only stone, eternal, incorruptible, resistant to time, could carry. What exactly did they keep? Some researchers believe that megaliths were repositories of knowledge astronomical, calendars, star maps, sky observation instruments. This does sense. Many of them have precise alignments with solstices, equinoxes, and specific constellations. But that's just the surface. Other scholars see something deeper, an attempt to fix the memory of a lost relationship between humanity and cosmos. These people seem to understand that the sky was not just a collection of distant lights, but a mirror of the human mind, that the cycles of the stars were also cycles of the soul, that the light that passed through a stone crack was the same one that crossed consciousness, And there are still those who argue that these people kept memories of an era previous. An era that ended abruptly, perhaps due to global cataclysms, perhaps due to violent climate changes, perhaps due to forces that we still do not understand. One ancient world that sank into oblivion, leaving only fragments, oral stories, myths, sacred constellations, and stones. Always rocks. This theory is echoed in the spiritual traditions of different cultures. The Mayans speak of the survivors of the first sun. The Egyptians revere the Neteru, beings who taught after the chaos. The Biao. Greeks narrate the existence of eras before current humanity. The indigenous peoples of the Americas remember the first who walked with the sky. In each tradition, the same archetypes: masters, guardians, survivors, transmitters. But there is something even more intriguing. The megaliths appear to have been erected at specific points on Earth, as if these people had chosen strategic locations, connected by invisible lines, forming energy or geographic networks that we have only begun to map. Today, many of these places coincide with tectonic faults, magnetic anomalies, or regions where the horizon opens perfect paths for observing the sky. Could this be chance? Was it instinct? Or was it a memory? Memory of knowledge that was not born with them, but that was entrusted to them. Remembrance of a mission greater than survival itself. The mission to ensure that humanity, one day, could find what it lost. And maybe that's why, when visiting these places, we feel something inexplicable. One presence. A calling. A kind of silent recognition, as if the soul say, "I've been here before." Because these monuments are not just ruins, are warnings. They are compasses. They are seeds of memory waiting to germinate. And it is precisely this seed that leads us to the final block, where the mystery finally finds its deepest form. At the end of this journey, when we gather together every stone, every myth, every echo left by the forgotten peoples, we realize that we were not just studying ancient ruins. We were studying ourselves, because these monuments, silent and colossal, they don't just talk about who built them. They talk about who we still are, and about who we may have once been. There is something deeply human about lifting a stone to the sky. It's as if the soul, intuitively, I looked for a way to make the invisible tangible. And when we think about ourselves, people who lived before the first civilizations, we understand that they did not raise these structures to dominate the world, but to understand it, not to impose power, but to remember where they came from, not to perpetuate itself, but to leave a clue for those who would come later. And we are those after. For millennia, we have looked at these megaliths with strangeness, trying to fit them into theories that would reassure us. But the truth is, they weren't made to fit simple explanations. They were meant to spark questions, to light the spark of sacred doubt, to remember that human history is greater than the straight line that we taught. When we walk among these stones, we feel a calling that is not rational. It's a call that is born in the chest, like an old memory that tries to emerge, a feeling that humanity has risen before, fallen before, rebuilt itself before, and left marks so that we would not forget our cosmic origins. Because deep down, the people who erected these monuments seem to have understood something we are only now beginning to remember. Life is cyclical. History is cyclical. The conscience, it is cyclical. The sky repeats itself, and so do we. And every time the cycle starts again, someone needs to keep the flame. Someone needs to preserve knowledge. Someone needs to lift the stone that signals the return of light. Perhaps this is why, when sunlight passes through the portal of a megalith exactly at the moment of the solstice, we feel something almost spiritual, as if time was bent, as if a dormant collective memory awakened, as if the ages talked among themselves and say, "You are not alone. You never have been." And that's what makes it all so deeply human. The stone is eternal, but whoever lifted it was made of flesh, of fear, of hope. They disappeared, as one day we too will disappear. But what they left behind keeps calling, keeps guiding, keeps teaching. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul may be remembering the path. What if what we call the end, is it just the beginning of a memory that humanity has not yet been able to decipher?